Imagine you're traveling with your family over the Sierra Nevada mountains. One of your guides turns to your father with a look of worry and says, "Something you can't quite catch," but your father replies, "Of course we'll make it. The sky is clear." And you believe him and rest without worry as your wagon bumps along the trail. And then something wet touches the roof of your wagon. And another. And suddenly it's snowing. You and your family make a camp at a lake and hope that the snow will clear. But it doesn't, and supplies are getting low, really low. Today we're talking about the Donner Party and how far humans will go for survival. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Jax, and this is Morbidly Macabre, the show where I talk about morbid history, true crime, cryptids, and other spooky topics that might catch my interest. I am so sorry I've been gone for so long. I thought I had my schedule worked out. I thought I was going to be able to film more and edit more and write more, and then life just really got away from me. But I'm back. It's nice to be back. It's nice to be filming again, and I am working on scripts for the next few videos already, so I should have something going soon. And thank you so much for subscribing. If you like what you see today, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more from me, please consider hitting the subscribe button and that bell notification icon. I also stream over on Twitch as often as I can at Jax Murray Gaming. Currently we are doing a playthrough of Dragon Age Inquisition. Now let's get into a story that I grew up with and a tragedy that I live near, the Donner Party. So who was the Donner Party? Well, the Donner Party was a group of almost 90 pioneers moving westward to California during a time known as westward expansion in the 1800s, 1846 to be exact. The Donner Party was led by George Donner and James Reed, who were traveling with their families and employees. Around this time of westward expansion, many pioneers were inspired by Manifest Destiny, the belief that the land that stretched between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans belonged to white Europeans. Some were inspired because of the gold rush in 1848, others because they saw it as a place to be fully Catholic or fully within their own religion without having to worry about puritanical beliefs. And others were moving for the climate. Though currently it's about 114 degrees Fahrenheit outside right now, so I am really questioning moving to California for the climate. But back to the Donners and Reeds. Their reasoning for going to California was the promise of free land and a better climate for James Reed's wife, who was very sick, and he hoped the change in climate would help her. On May 12, 1846, they set out from Independence, Missouri, and began the journey to California, along with nearly 500 other wagons. Within a week of leaving, the Reeds and Donners joined a group of 50 additional wagons led by William H. Russell, and by June they had traveled 450 miles and were about 200 miles away from Fort Laramie. There were delays in their travels, such as rain and a flooded river, but they were hopeful that this trip would be largely uneventful, and they would get there safely. In a letter from Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, she states, "Indeed, if I do not experience something far worse than I have yet done, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started." If only she knew how much worse it would get. Now let's talk about the third person of major importance in this, Lansford Hastings. Lansford Hastings made the trip to California from Ohio in 1842, and to encourage more people to join him in the untapped natural beauty and opportunities, he published a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. He proposed a new route, an alternate route, a better route to the the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, the already well-established routes with already well-established dangers and mostly known issues that could arise. His direct route, which actually added more miles to the journey across the Great Basin, through Wasatch Range and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Was it the way that he himself crossed over into California? No. But he did travel through it in early 1846. He stayed at Fort Bridger to persuade other pioneers and travelers to take the same route that he did. Now, it is very important to mention that when he did the trip across this trail, he was not accompanied by wagons. It was critical to get across the Sierra Nevadas, which are the most dangerous part of this trail. You need to be on time, no delays, no issues, nothing. It needs to be a perfect crossing because it gets more snow than most North American mountain ranges, and it's very steep. But back to the Donners and the Reeds. On July 12th, a writer approached the party with a letter from Hastings. In the letter, it stated that there was an opposition from Mexican authorities and that they needed to band in a large group and take his trail. The letter also told them of his new path, the Hastings Cutoff, as he called it, and that he would be waiting to guide the party through his new path. On July 20th, the Donners and Reed parties split off from the main group that they were traveling with at Little Sandy River, and the others opted to continue on the already well-established trail, while this smaller group decided to head to Fort Bridger and meet with Hastings and see what he was all about. A journalist, Edwin Bryan, reached the fort ahead of the Donner party, and knowing that this trail would be difficult for any parties with wagons, he left letters with the fort to give to the pioneers who were willing to take this chance and take this trail. When the party arrived, Jim Bridger told the party that it would be a much safer and quicker path to go through the Hastings Cutoff, and it's thought that he concealed the letters from Bryant from the pioneers in order to get more profit from Hastings, because he profited if more people took this cutoff. Hastings himself had already left with another group of travelers, and at this point, James Reed had been warned not to take this trail, and he was told not to take this cutoff by an old friend who was coming from California. So somebody with experience, somebody who knew the path, but they did not heed any warnings, however, and left the fort on July 31st. Lansford Hastings had never tested his proposed route with wagons, misleadingly promoting it as a shortcut. The terrain was much more difficult than described, and the path itself was much harder to find. Hastings wrote letters and stuck them to trees, hoping that pioneers traveling on this path would see those letters, and they would attempt to follow his path. And on August 6th, the party found a letter stuck to a tree saying to stop there and wait for his return, and he would show them the way, the alternate path. Reed and Charles T. Stanton and William Pike rode ahead to find Hastings and found an even more difficult path, a canyon path that had roads blocked by boulders. Stanton and Pike stopped to rest, and Reed returned to the party 4 days later on August 10th. With no guide, they had to make the decision of whether to return to the pre-tested and well-worn path and arguably much safer Oregon Trail, or proceed with the Hastings Cutoff. And they unfortunately chose the cutoff. As they worked across the Wasatch Range, another group of travelers joined them, the Graves family, and they brought with them another 3 wagons. The arrival of this family, the last to leave Missouri, made the Donner Party the back of the group traveling to California for this year. They were very behind schedule, and due to the difficulty of the path, their wagon had slowed down to about 1.5 miles per day, with people needing a clearer path. On August 20th, they arrived at a point where they could see the Great Salt Lake Desert, and it took them another 9 to 10 days to fully get out of the Wasatch Range. Supplies were beginning to run low, and Stanton and Pike were finally found, having become lost on their way back, and they were near starving. On August 25th, Luke Halloran died of consumption. Luke Halloran was traveling with the larger group and was already sick. When the Donners split off from the main group back at Little Sandy River, the Donners took Luke in because his own family wagon couldn't take care of him anymore, and they no longer had the supplies to take care of him. A few days later, they found a letter from Hastings, worn and tattered, saying that the next 2 days of travel were going to be rough. There was no grass for the oxen and no water. They were entering a desert. On August 30th, they entered into the Great Salt Lake Desert. Instead of a 2 days travel, it ended up being 6. Oxen became crazed from starving and ran off into the desert. Wagons sunk into the ground and became stuck. Oxen were left and abandoned with the wagons. Some just died of starvation. Some wagons were damaged beyond repair, and at the end of the journey, no human lives were lost, but their faith in this Hastings cutoff was. And Reed, who incurred the heaviest losses of oxen, insisted on getting an inventory of supplies from all of the other wagons. He also attempted to send 2 men, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, to Sutter Fort in California in an attempt to get more supplies, but they returned with more bad news. There was another 40 miles of desert ahead of them. They were able to get through this section mostly unscathed, and finally, 2 months after leaving for the Hastings cutoff, they were able to rejoin the trail along the Humboldt River. This cutoff put them over a month behind, and that extra month would prove to be deadly. The Donner family split off from the Reed family to attempt to make better time. 2 wagons in Reed's group became tangled together, and out of frustration, a member of Reed's group, John Snyder, beat one of the ox. Reed intervened, and Snyder responded by beating Reed with a whip handle. And when Reed's wife attempted to help Reed, she too was hit. Reed then killed Snyder by stabbing him. Of course, this is the trail. There weren't any laws governing wagons traveling through what was, at that point, Mexican territory. And Snyder was much more liked than Reed at this point. Reed was then exiled from the group, unarmed. His stepdaughter was able to sneak a rifle to him and some food, so at least he had a fighting chance of survival. This created a leadership vacuum in the group that he was traveling with, and sowed discord among the group. Reed then caught up with the Donners. Reed and one of the Teamsters, Walter Herron, then rode ahead to Sutter Fort, and the rest of the party once again caught up to the Donners. At this point, Paiute Native Americans were killing or stealing their horses and oxen. To lighten the load on the existing oxen they no longer sat in the wagons. They got out and walked along the wagon. One of the party members, known as Hardcoop, was an old man, nearly 70 years old, which at this time was very old. He was forced to walk, and one day he sat next to a stream, and his feet were so swollen and painful that they were splitting open. He was never seen again. He is thought to have died from exposure. So far, they had lost nearly 100 cattle and oxen. Their rations were almost depleted, and when one of the members, Wolfinger, along with 2 men he was traveling with, Reinhardt and Spitzer, stopped to cache or bury his wagon, Wolfinger was killed by an attack from Paiute Native Americans, and Reinhardt and Spitzer returned alone. The Eddy family were forced to abandon their wagon after Native Americans killed all of their oxen, and they were forced to walk carrying their children after none of the other pioneers were willing to help. Margaret Reed and her children also lost their wagon. Soon after all of this, they found the Truckee River and a beautiful, lush area, but they pressed onwards. They needed to cross the Sierra Nevadas before the snow. Stanton returned to the party with 2 Miwok men, known to history as Luis and Salvador, to be guides. He also brought with him mules and food and news that Reed and Heron arrived at Sutter's Fort and they were pretty okay, but they were starving. And this must have been a great relief to the party. Perhaps they thought the worst was behind them, but the worst was yet to come. On October 20th, they had to make the decision if they should proceed over a mountain pass that is now known as Donner's Pass. They were told that there wouldn't be snow until the middle of November. Surely they had enough time, right? An event that seemed to solidify the decision for them to proceed ahead was William Pike was killed accidentally when a gun being loaded by William Foster was discharged. Foster was traveling with the Murphy family. Now, at this point, let's specify the order in which the families proceeded to attempt this crossing and name some of the key people of the party. First, it was the Breens, consisting of Patrick Breen, his wife Margaret, and their children and neighbor Patrick Dolan. The second family was the Keysburgs, consisting of Louis Keysburg, his wife Elizabeth Philippine, and their daughter Ada and son Louis Jr., who was born on the trail. Third, the Reeds, Graves, and Murphy family. The Reeds was James Reed, his wife Margaret, and children. They also hired Milford Elliott, James Smith, and Walter Heron to drive the ox teams, and Bayless Williams and his sister Eliza went along as hired help. The Graves family was Franklin Ward Graves, his wife Elizabeth, and their children and son-in-law. Lavina Murphy, a widow, and her children and her married daughters and their family. The Eddy family consisted of William Eddy, his wife Eleanor, and their children. And finally we come to the Donner family, which consisted of George and Tamsin Donner and their children. George's brother Jacob also joined with his wife Elizabeth and their children. They also had hired teamsters Hiram Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. At this point, with the Donner Party taking up the rear of the group made their way to Truckee Lake, and then the snow began to fall. The Breens, Eddies, and Keysburgs met near a cabin that was previously built and attempted to make it over the pass, but they were unable to make it through the snowdrifts and completely lost the trail. At that point, all of the families were at the lake, minus the Donners, who were about a half-day's travel away and opted to stay down at Alder Creek. On November 4th, it began to snow again, and they built makeshift cabins, the Breens occupying one cabin, the Eddies and Murphys in a second, and the Reeds and Graves in the third. The Keysburgs built a little lean-to that was up against the Breen cabin. They used canvas or oxhide for their roofs, and there were no doors or windows, just an opening for people to enter. There were 60 people at Truckee Lake, and the Donner family had tents down by Alders Creek, and that evening on November 4th, a snowstorm began that lasted for 8 days. There was already very little food from the remaining supplies. The oxen began to die due to severe weather, and their carcasses were stacked for consumption. They were unfortunately not familiar with catching fish, so though there was a whole lake and creek next to them that hadn't frozen over, it was not a food source for them. One of the men managed to kill a bear, but after that he wasn't able to find any other sources of meat. The supplies were quickly becoming a desperate situation. They often attempted to navigate in groups, leaving the wagons back at the camp, but were unable to. Another storm came through, and the remaining cattle and horses died and were soon lost to the snow. Soon they were eating oxhide and catching mice in an attempt to have food. They would trek over to the Donners, which was a full day's travel, and then news came that Jacob Donner and 3 of the men had died. Reinhardt, one of the deceased, confessed before his death that he killed Wolfinger, not the Paiutes, and he blamed it on the Paiute Native Americans. And George Donner's hand had become infected due to a wound he sustained fixing a broken axle. They were so desperate for food that they began to eat the oxhide on their roofs. Now let's talk about the forlorn hope. They were so desperate and starving that people began to die. Spitzer and Williams died from malnutrition. A party of men, women, and children made some snowshoes and attempted to cross the mountain pass on their own. They packed lightly and hoped to make it to Bear Valley. The members were Antonio, an animal handler, Luis and Salvador, the Native American guides, Charles Berger, Patrick Dolan, William Eddy, Jay Fosdick, Sarah Fosdick, Sarah Foster, William Foster, Franklin Graves, Mary Ann Graves, Lemuel Murphy, William Murphy, Amanda McCutcheon, Harriet Pike, and Charles Stanton. Charles Berger and William Murphy turned back because they didn't have snowshoes. Charles Stanton, however, was the first to die, but he didn't die with the party. He told them that he would follow shortly, and he passed away. He was found the following year. The party, though, became lost and confused and were already so desperate for food that they were debating if somebody among them should die in order to feed the others when Antonio passed away, followed by Franklin Graves, and Patrick Dolan was the next, ranting and stripping off his clothes, something known as paradoxical undressing. They began to eat Dolan's body. Lemuel Murphy died after, at 12 years old, and was the youngest of the forlorn hope to pass away. Eddie, Salvador, and Louise refused to eat the human meat. The next day, they stripped the muscle and organs from the bodies, dried them up for storage, and continued off. Eddie eventually succumbed and ate the flesh. Once again, the food ran out, and they began disassembling their shoes to eat the oxhide and discussing murdering the 2 Native American guides, Louise and Salvador. Eddie warned them, and they were able to get away from the party. Jay Fosdick died in the night, and Eddie and Mary Graves left to go hunting. They returned with some deer meat, but by the time they got back, Jay Fosdick was already being prepared for consumption. After a few more days of traveling, around 25 days since they left Truckee Lake, Salvador and Louise were found, starving and probably already very near death. William Foster shot them, and they were then butchered and dried for food. A few days after this, 33 days since they left Truckee Lake, they found a Native American settlement. The Native Americans fed them some grass and acorns and pine nuts, and Eddie set out with a few of the members of the tribe to a nearby community and rescued the other 6 survivors. Of the original 15 men and women and children who were on this trip, not counting the 2 who turned back, 7 survived. Now let's get to the rescue and the many rescue attempts. The first attempt was by Reed, however, he couldn't get to them with the snow. The second attempt was with William Eddy, the survivor from Forlorn Hope. They arrived at the camp near the lake on February 18th. They fed the survivors small rations since they were so starved. They didn't want to overfeed them at this point. All of the cabins were buried, 13 people were dead, and they were barely buried in the snow. They also gathered some people from the Donners. Of the survivors, they brought back 23 people, leaving 21 back at the Truckee Lake, and 12 at Alders Creek. 3 more pioneers died on the way down the mountain. The third rescue attempt was with Reed and McCutcheon, who with a man named John Stark were successful. Reed reunited with his wife and children. In the Breen cabin, the occupants were fairly well, but in the Murphy cabin, it was awful. Lavina was nearly blind and had deteriorated mentally severely, and the children were listless and dirty. The second relief group saw 17 more people leaving from Truckee, leaving only Keseberg, Mrs. Murphy, her son, and one of Eddie's children and one of the foster children. Tamsen Donner stayed behind with George Donner and her children. On the way back down the mountain, there was a blizzard, and the Breen and Graves family stayed behind at what became known as Starved Camp, while the rest headed onward. They were so starved and exhausted, they just couldn't continue at that point. They needed to regain some strength. When Elizabeth Graves and her son perished, the party consumed them to survive. Back at the camp, 3 members of the rescue party still remained. Charles Stone, who was at Truckee Lake, and Charles Cady and Nicholas Clark at Alder Creek. While Clark was out hunting, trying to get some more food, Cady and Stone made a plan to leave. Tamsen tried to get them to take her daughters with them, but they only took the girls as far as Truckee Lake and left them there, and they headed off without them. They also passed by Starved Camp, but they did nothing to help the survivors there. Clark and one of the remaining survivors, Trudeau, were going to head for California together after this point, and saw that the Donner girls were at the other camp, and they returned to Alder Creek to let Tamsen know. Foster and Eddie went back up the mountain and met with John Stark, and began heading back to Truckee Lake to get the last of the survivors, passing Starved Camp on their way there. Foster and Eddie continued on to Truckee Lake, while John Stark stayed and saved the 11 survivors who remained at Starved Camp. Foster and Eddie arrived back at Truckee Lake on March 14th and found that both of their children were deceased, with Keseberg stating that he ate Eddie's son. Eddie then told Keseberg that if they ever crossed paths again, he would murder the man. At the Alder Creek camp, the 2 remaining people were George Donner and his brother's child. Tamsen Donner went to the Truckee camp to be with her daughters, and when the rescuers offered to take her with them, she chose to return to her husband. They took the 3 Donner girls, Simon Murphy and Trudeau and Clark, back down the mountain. Lavina died shortly after this, and so did George Donner. George Donner's hand infection had spread over his entire arm, up his shoulder, and ultimately killed him in the end. And Tamsen Donner also passed away. There is a belief that Keseberg killed Tamsen because they found a pot full of human flesh along with items from the Donner family in what is now his cabin. Of the 87 that went on this journey, 48 survived. The Reed family and the Breen family were mostly intact. The Donners and the Graves children were orphaned, and William Eddy was alone, and the Murphy family mostly died. Some of those who survived denied the cannibalism ever took place. Others stated right out that it did, in fact, happen and take place, but for survival. Diaries and historical records of the time also indicate that there was a level of cannibalism, and the survivors went on to live separate lives, some very traumatized by the events, some too young to remember. But Donner Pass is now named Donner Pass in their honor. There is a museum there too to commemorate the events and those who lost their lives. And history will remember their story, for it is truly one that shows how far humans will go to survive. Thank you so much for joining me today and watching today's video. If you found the story interesting, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more from me, hit that subscribe button and that bell notification icon so you can be alerted whenever there's a new video. If you'd like to see some of my other content, some more lighthearted content, check out my channel, and if you want to catch me live, I'm on Twitch at Jax Murray Gaming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. And as always, stay curious. Goodbye.